This time I'd like to welcome back the English Language Arts supervisors who are going to review some item types and sample questions.
So we want to give you an overview of what the ELA test will look like for students. There are 3 focus areas. There's literary analysis, research simulation, and narrative writing. The literary analysis primarily expects students to look at literary-worthy texts to be able to respond to questions and write an essay. The research simulation is just a very overly fancy word for saying that they're going to look at informational texts, the science and social studies texts, and have to, again, respond to some questions and then, on some cases, write an essay. The narrative writing asks students to read and respond to a story. Not a traditional essay, but they may be asked to continue that story or to take the essay from another character's perspective. So those are the 3 focus areas. And then there's 3 types of questions that your children will encounter. There's evidence-based selected responses, there's technology-enhanced constructed responses, and prose constructed responses. We're going to talk about each of them in detail and let you guys see some samples from the actual Parcc website. The prose constructed response, just to note, doesn't appear on the end of the year because that's an essay, and so like Ms. Rumbo-Morel already told you, that the evidence-based and the technology ones are the ones that are machine scoreable, the essays aren't, so that's why we won't see it on the end of year. So the evidence-based selected response. We've already covered the standards, or the new standards, with you. What the evidence-based selected response does, it looks at least 2 reading standards in each question. That these questions may have multiple parts, so they might include a part A and a part B. The part B question often depends on information that the student had to extract in part A. So to give you an example of what it might look like.
Okay, let's take a look at this fancy example here. In this particular question, students watched a video, so that's a part of Parcc that we haven't talked a lot about. They may have to watch a video and use the information that they learned in the video to answer questions. This is a 2-part question. Part A might just ask them, let's say, to identify the main idea. And part B might just ask them how they know that and which sentence in the text or in the video help them figure part A out. A lot of the questions, so they're still multiple choice, but they're interrelated. They're not isolated multiple choice questions. On the NJ Ask, if you recall, students read a passage, not connected to another passage, and probably answered 10 multiple choice questions and 2 open-ended questions. Do you remember that? There are no more open-ended questions. None at all. Either they're writing an essay or they're answering these type questions.
The second type of question is the technology-enhanced constructed response. Basically, they're the same skills, it targets the same skills that all the multiple choice questions did on the previous standardized tests, but just in a different format. And so they might ask students to drag and drop an answer, to highlight the text. You might ask them to annotate the text. An example might look like the following, where you can see the boxes at the right-hand side that ask the students to drag 3 details from the story that help them understand the main idea.
So in school, we've been giving our students lots of opportunities to practice on what we call the Chromebooks. I don't know if your kids have told you about the Chromebooks. And at home, you can do the same. So your computer has either an actual mouse, like in the old days, or now it has the fancy mouse pad. They need a lot of practice being able to hold on to that mouse and click and drag things. So as much as you can get them off their phones and onto those computers, that is very helpful. They're still answering a question, but now they have to use their technological skills to move the answer into the right spots. Very fancy technology-based work.
Just to note that even the students who are taking the test on the Chromebooks will have mice, so you don't have to worry about them learning to drag and drop and learning a whole new skill that maybe they're not familiar with, especially at the lower levels. So we're definitely making those accommodations for our students. The final type of question is the prose constructive response, which again, you're right, Mrs. Morel, they did get very fancy in the English language arts section. Prose constructive response just means an essay. So students will be expected to have a clear purpose in their writing, to use language from the Common Core writing standards, to address the audience that's specified in the prompt, to state their topic, their issue, their argument. Obviously, as the grade levels go up, just like the standards increase in rigor, the expectations on the Parcc prose constructive response would increase in expectation as well. An example?
So the major difference from NJS to Parcc is that students used to have isolated writing prompts. For example, don't quote me on this, but I'll make one up on the fly. Convince your principal to buy laptops for every student. That may have been the persuasive writing task. Students no longer see isolated out of context prompts like that. Everything they write about now is related to something they already read, which is very helpful because it ensures that all students have the same background knowledge, which is that text that they just read. And they don't have to rely on knowing things that hasn't been taught or they don't know anything about. So this is an example of a prose constructive response. It's very hard to see, so I'm just going to read it to you. This is actually a high school example, but in one of the links we direct you to Parcc where you can see all grade levels of examples. In this example, students read 2 poems. And what they're basically being asked to do is to figure out, compare, or contrast what's different about these 2 poems. Specifically, the task says, develop your claim of, let me read it from here because I can't even see it up there, of how Sexton transforms Daedalus and Icarus with evidence from both texts. And Daedalus is a character in a Greek mythology. At the starting point, you may want to consider what is emphasized, what is absent, or what is different in the 2 texts. But feel free to develop your own focus for analysis. Like I said, that is a high school example. But technically, all students will be asked to do something similar, just with a text that is more grade appropriate. In this case, it was 2 poems. It could be 2 short stories. It could be 2 plays, or 2 articles. Oh, that was it for us.
All right, good evening. My name is Carrie Aloisio. I'm the math supervisor at the high school. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening to review with you the types of questions and sample items for the math portion of the Parcc assessments. For us, the math assessment questions are about merging the focus areas that Mrs. Lamphere spoke about earlier with the key fluencies and the mathematical practices. It is true, again, we have no fancy names for our types of questions. So we have type 1 questions. These are the questions that focus on concept skills and procedures. They are entirely machine scorable, but they are technology enhanced. So it's not just straight choose A, choose B, choose C. You'll see from the example there are a whole bunch of different ways that we get a machine scorable type question for mathematics. These types of questions will appear on both the end-of-year assessment and the performance-based assessment. In fact, the end-of-year assessment is entirely made up of type 1 questions, all machine scorable. So this is an example of a type 1 question at the elementary level. Again, thinking that it is machine scorable, essentially the students have to prove that 1/2 is the same as 3/6. Now, when we think about the mathematical practices that we saw earlier, you can see here an example of how students need to reason abstractly and also how they need to use tools appropriately. So essentially what happens is the student will drag the triangle to divide the line to the appropriate sections and then highlight the fraction bar to illustrate either 1/2 or 3/6, showing that they are essentially the same thing. Got it? Okay. The type 2 questions are similar to questions that we have seen before, maybe the open-ended type questions that they're used to seeing on the NJS or HESPA. These are a combination of machine scored and hand scored. They require the students to give written justifications, critiques of arguments, or precision in their mathematical statements. These will appear only on the performance-based section of the test, which is the one that is given in March. So this is an 8th grade example of a type 2 question. In the first part of the question, the students need to drag different representations of triangles into 2 boxes and classify them as either right triangles or not right triangles. So as you can see, we have just side lengths, we have vertices, we have graphical representations of the triangles as well. In the second part of the question, they have to justify why the triangles are or are not right triangles based on their knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem. So again, we see a mathematical practice here in conjunction with the content, which would be constructs viable arguments and also attends to precision, not only in their calculations, but also in their vocabulary and their word usage in their communication of their ideas. The third type of question is the modeling and applications questions. This calls for students to model real-world contexts or scenarios using their mathematical language, again, at a grade-appropriate developmental level. It can link with any of the mathematical practices. It is a combination of machine scorable and hand scorable, but they will only appear on the end of year on the performance-based assessment. Okay, so type 3 questions only on the performance-based piece. So this is an Algebra 1 example of of a type 3 question. Please keep in mind that this is Algebra 1 and your child at any grade level will get a developmentally appropriate version of this type of question. So essentially in this question, the students are given a scenario when a student runner named Brett is posed against an Olympian who has just visited their track practice. And you see by the picture and by the description, he gets a little bit of a head start. He gets about a 20-meter head start before the gold medal winner starts running. In the context of the problem, they're also given the rate at which each runner is running, what is their pace, and to assume that they're running at a constant rate. The question in the first part asks them to develop a model or an equation that represents each runner. And then in the second piece of the question, they have to decide who will win the race and explain why they know that. Again, our mathematical practices that are linked to this question would be modeling and also writing viable arguments and attending to precision in your calculations and in your representation of the answer. Okay, the last piece that I'm going to talk to you about is also linked to one of the mathematical practices, which is uses tools appropriately. One of the tools that our students frequently use on standardized assessments is the calculator. So right here you see the calculator policy for the Parcc assessments, and it's a little bit different than what you're used to seeing on the NJ Asks, so we thought we would spend some time talking about it. This is particularly important when you think about the list of key fluencies that we talked about earlier in the evening. Any of those things that are on that list means the students need to be able to do them without a calculator. Every unit in the middle and the high school will have a calculator portion of an assessment and a non-calculator portion. Okay? At the elementary level, there is no calculator usage at all, so there's no reason to differentiate between the two sections. Hang on one second, let me finish and then So for grades 3 through 5, there's no calculator unless you have an accommodation, and we're going to get to the accommodations piece after this. Grades 6 and 7 will only be permitted to use a 4-function calculator with a square root symbol and percentage functions. This is slightly different than what they were permitted to use on the NJ Ask, because that was a scientific calculator for NJ Ask. So we have a small little change in this on those 2 grade levels. Grade 8 will have a scientific calculator, and any student taking a high school assessment, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, or Geometry, and that includes middle school students that are enrolled in those classes, they will be permitted to use a calculator with the functionality of the TI-84 graphing calculator. These calculators can be handheld, but they will also be a simulator or an emulator built into the test for the appropriate questions for which they apply. Hit it. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Phones are not permitted in the testing environment, no. So if a student has their own calculator, they are permitted to use it, but there will be extras on hand. As long as the student's calculator matches the allowable functionality, they're allowed to use their own calculator. Of course, the graphing calculator memories will all be cleared before they're allowed to use it in the testing session. Yes, ma'am, they will be permitted scrap paper. Absolutely, yes. And graph paper. There is also, which will appear later, but there's also tools built into the testing environment, that, for example, an online protractor, an online ruler, depending upon what the question is, they can also use if it's appropriate. Okay? All right, I think Dr. Stromlin's up. Can say, do they have extra tools? Absolutely, and we'll show you where you can go later on, but rest assured all of the tutorials and things that the students are completing in their classrooms are available for the parents to view at home or practice with them if you want to do that.